Hello everyone, today I'll show you how you can get a smooth camera transition from first person to third person view in your character for your game. So let's start with building this system. You can see the camera is smoothly moving from the third person to the first person view and you can control it everywhere. Let's start with creating this in our blueprint. Let's open our character. For this setup, you would need to have 3 cameras. For your basic third-person camera on a camera boom, like it's by default in the third-person camera template. So you probably already have this camera. If not, make a camera boom component, then make this forward camera attached to the camera boom. It's spring arm component, sorry. For the second camera, you would need to have it under your character mesh. So select the character mesh, click on the add component and type camera. We'll parent this camera under the head bone for our character because now it's defaulting on the 0 position on the blueprint. But if we attach it here by this parent socket to the head bone, you can see the camera is moved at the location of the head and it's moving with our character. So this is great, exactly what we want. We would also need now to rotate the camera for proper orientation. Let's try with the values. So let's rotate it -90 in the X direction. And let's rotate it 90 degrees into the Z direction. This way it points properly. The red arrow, which is the X-axis, you want to point forward from your character head. And the blue arrow, which is the Z-axis, you want to point up. So we can move the camera a bit, let's say 5 units, to be closer to the center of the head of our character. And let's move it in the Y direction, let's say 5 units as well. For now, let's choose this location. We'll probably move it a bit later, but let's compile and save this character. And we'll need a third camera. We'll do under our camera boom, where we have our forward camera. So let's add this third camera. And let's call it temp camera, for example, our temporary camera. So it's exactly on the same spot as our forward camera. So this is the new temp camera at 0, 0 location on the camera boom arm. So this is the setup. We'll use the forward camera in the beginning when we hit the play button. When we hit some button, for example, let's say the C button, let's go into our event graph, let's find some space and let's start typing keyboard. You can add action mapping into your game project settings, but for the purpose of the tutorial, let's create it like this. So when you hit the C key, so right click into the event graph for your character and start typing keyboard and find the C key. So when you press the C key, the first thing that you want to do is to set the world transform of your temp camera to match the transform of your forward camera, because we'll start from the position of our third person and we'll go to the position of our first person camera. So let's rename our first person camera to FP for first person. So we have the first person, the temp and the forward camera. So let's start with getting the world transform for our forward camera. Then let's set the temp camera world transform. So control drag the temp camera here, set world transform. Let's connect this to the C button. When we hit the C key, let's connect the transform of our forward camera to the transform of our temp camera. We are setting the position, rotation and scale of our temporary camera to the one of our forward camera. Then let's activate this temp camera. Let's go first and select the temp camera into the component panel. Type active here and disconnect auto activate. Let's do the same for our first person camera. Let's not auto activate it. So when we have our game started, this forward camera is the only one that it will auto activate. So it will be the active camera for our character. Then we'll set the position when pressing the C key of our temp camera. And let's then activate our temp camera. So control drag it in your graph, drag out of it and set active. So let's set this active to true, this new active pin, checkbox. Let's set this to true. And let's set our forward camera to not be active. So this new active for the forward camera will be false. Let's make sure that our first person camera is not active as well. Let's set active for our first person camera to false. Then let's create a timeline node. Timeline. Choose add timeline and call it camera transition. This camera transition node, let's actually play from start for now. We can experiment later with the play, but let's play from start. And what we want to do, let's go inside this camera transition node. We want to set the length, for example, to 1 second. Let's add a float track. Let's right click here and add a key. Time will be 0 and the value will be 0. Let's right click and add another key for time 1 and value 1. Let's frame this. So what this track does is for 1 second, so this length here, 1 second, it's changing this float value from 0 to 1. If you hover your mouse somewhere over this line, it will tell you for which time what the value will be. Currently they will be matching because we have the value from 0 to 1 and the length from 0 to 1. If they're not matching, for example, if my second keyframe is on time 0.5 but the value is 1, you can see that at 0.25 of time my value will be 0.5. So if you hover over the line, you will get the exact values for each time period, but we'll use a time of 1 and value of 1 for our second keyframe and 0, 0 for our first one. Let's go back into our event graph. What we will do is for each frame of the animation, we will move our temp camera to the position closer to the position of our first person camera, and when we get to the end, their positions will match. So let's control drag our temp camera and our first person camera here. Let's get the world transform for both of them. And let's do a lerp for transform. The first one will be the one of our temp camera, which is currently our active camera. And the second value here, the B value, will be the transform of our first person camera. And the alpha will be this value from 0 to 1, which will update every frame of our game for 1 second. So let's drag out of the update function. Let's set the world transform for our temp camera. So we are moving our temp camera closer and closer to the position of our first person camera. So connect the lerp to the new transform. This will move the camera closer and closer until the value here reaches 1. Then the alpha will be only sending the value from the first person camera world transform here into our temp camera world transform. This setup will move your camera for 1 second from the position of the third person to the first person. Let's go in the game and check if everything works. When I hit the play button, I'm in the game, and when I click the C button, you can see properly that my camera is moved to the first person view. Currently, every time I hit the C button, it moves from the third person to the first person. So let's go back and create the other transition from the first person to the third person. Let's move everything here a bit right. And when we press the C key, let's do a flip-flop note. What this note does is the first time it enters, it's executing the A command. The second time it enters, it's executing the B command. Our B command, what we want to do is pretty similar. So we'll set the world transform for our temp camera to be the same as the one for our first person camera. Let's connect it here. After this, we will set the temp camera to be activated, our third and first person to be deactivated. So the same as before. Then we'll do a timeline. Let's call this camera transition third person. And let's go inside this timeline. Let's create a track with a length of 1. It will be a float track. 2 keyframes, 0, 0 for the first one, and 1, 1 for the second keyframe. So we have this diagonal line between 0 and 1. Let's compile and save. Go back into our event graph, and we'll set the world transform from our first person camera to our third person camera. So here where we have the before the first person camera, let's get the follow camera And let's connect here the result. Let me move everything and I'll show you again the connections. Okay. So the first time when we click the C key, we are getting the position of our focal camera and setting our temp camera to this position. And the second time we are getting the position of our first person camera and setting this one into our temp camera. We are activating the temp camera and deactivating the other two. Then we are updating for 1 second the position first time from the third person to the first person and the second time from the first person to the third person, and we are setting the world transform. What you need to do in both cases after this animation is finished, you need to set this temp camera and the camera that you want to activate with the proper values. So let's connect this finished event here. We want to deactivate this temp camera and activate our first person camera into the first case, into the second case here. We will activate our focal camera instead of the first person. In that case, you should have now this system work in both directions. Let's go into the game and test it. We are in the game. Let's hit the C key. This changes to our first person camera. Let's hit the C key again. This changes to our third person camera. There is some problem with the change to our third person camera. It's snapping instead of moving. Okay, so let's connect this to play from start instead of play, because the first time it transitions properly, but every time that you activate this again, the curve, the timeline is already on the last frame, so that's why you don't get the animation. So we'll play from start every time for both timelines. And in this way, it should be better. I have also a problem with the orientation of the camera and the movement of the camera when I'm in the first person. And for the first person camera, let's drag out of here and set controller rotation yaw. And let's set this to true. And for our third person camera, let's copy this note here and let's set it to false. Let's see if this is the exact values. Let's hit play. Let's hit the C key. Now I can rotate my view. And if I hit the C key, everything works fine. There's a little bit of delay before this starts working. So let's do it before the timeline. both of the cases. Let's compile and save it. And now it works better. I cannot look up or down. Let's add some logic to the position of the camera to be able to look everywhere, not just side to side like it's currently. So the default setup for the camera input for the third-person character looks like this. And for a better setup that will allow you to control the first-person camera, let's drag the first-person camera here into the scene to get a reference. Let's get the relative rotation. Let's break this rotator, and from this rotator we'll use the X and Y values exactly as they are, but the Z value will add, so drag right the plus sign and we'll add this action value Y. The up and down direction of your mouse will add it here into the input for the yaw. Let's now make a rotator, drag out of the values here, and make rotator, connect the X and Y, and the result from adding this input to our current rotation into the Z. So this make rotator, it will be used for our first person camera. Let's set relative rotation for our camera, and let's use this value that we calculated here. Let's compile now and save it. So if we go into our game, let's hit the C key. Now I can move side to side, but I can look up or down as well. So it's really much better. You can look up or down, you can see your character hands and feet while running. So this setup is much better. I can hit the C key and start looking from the third person view. So this is how you can make this transition seem smooth. There is a problem where if you hit the C key in less than 1 second, it's confused by this input. It's not finished the previous timeline. So let's fix this by going into our function to change the view. Here it is. So before this flip-flop, let's add a do once function, and this do once function, it will execute the code only one time. So if you hit the C key, it will not do anything. And when we finish the execution, after everything is passed, we'll trigger a custom event to reset this do once so we can do it again. So let's right click here and add a custom event. Let's call it reset camera transition, and let's connect it to the reset note here. Now let's go here into our finished pin. After we set active the first person camera, let's call this camera transition, reset camera transition event, and we'll call the same event again when we finish the transition to the third person. If I compile and save now, let's hit play. And now in the game, if I hit the C key multiple times, it always works. You just need to hit it more than 1 second away. If you like this tutorial, you can like and subscribe for the channel. If you want some additional perks like getting early access to videos, you can join the channel. This will support me and help me continue publishing tutorials here. And please comment if this helps you release your game or make it better. I'll check the comments for ideas for new tutorials, and guys, I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye!